All right. Hello, friends. Come on in. We'll give you another minute here while everyone is joining.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm Todd Bolsinger with Josiah Solis and Tom Sine. Josiah is the one actually running this event today, but we're from the Church Leadership Institute. We're thrilled that you're here. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Welcome. People are still coming in, so we'll give another minute or so here for everyone to join.
As you're coming in, know that a bit later today, we're going to give you opportunities to ask some questions. We'll be using the QA function. So if you are, by this time, you're all Zoom experts, and I know you're particularly able and gifted at that. So along the way, if you'd like to just put a question into the QA section, you can do so, and that will be really helpful for you to be able to do so. So we can capture the questions, and I'll get a chance to ask them. I'll be moderating them for Tom. So.
All right. Just give it another minute here as people continue coming in. Very, very happy you all could join us today. All right. Todd, shall we get started?
Yeah, let's go. Let's begin.
All right. All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar today with Todd Bolsinger and Tom Sine. We're very, very happy to have you here. My name is Josiah Solis. I am the Director of Digital Learning and Operations here at the Church Leadership Institute. So I'm the one you've received emails from, and we're very happy you all are here today. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction to what we do here at CLI, and then I'll introduce our speakers today, and we'll hand it over to Todd and Tom. So the Church Leadership Institute is obviously based at Fuller Seminary. We are housed under the Dupree Center for Leadership, and we serve to form church leaders to lead faithful change in a rapidly changing and disruptive world. So our primary purpose really is to serve Christian pastors and leaders who are seeking to lead their communities through deep and hard change. Often pastors that say things like, "Seminary didn't prepare me for this. I'm not sure I can survive this." And so we really seek, to help Christian pastors and leaders who are dealing with hard changes. And a key part of that change process is learning to identify pain points. And Todd will come into that, which is what brings you here today, so we can dive into the work of Tom Sine. We offer content through our courses that you can find on Fuller Equip. And we also offer content through our podcast hosted by Marcus Watson called the Spiritual Life for Leadership Podcast. Highly encourage you to download that, subscribe wherever you can. There's episodes posted every single week, and there's including one with Tom there that you can find. And we host these webinars from time to time as well. So today's webinar, as you all know, we're titled "The Leadership and the Challenges Facing Our Neighbors Today and Tomorrow." And again, our primary speaker is going to be Tom Sine. I'm going to give a brief introduction to Tom, and Todd will further introduce Tom at a personal level. But Tom Sine holds a PhD in intellectual history from the University of Washington with a minor in strategic foresight. He taught for Fuller Seminary at the Extension campus in Seattle for 24 some years on creating a Christian worldview in changing times. He's also headed many community development projects in Haiti and around the world, and he offers what he calls future creativity consulting workshops for nonprofits and for churches. He has a couple of recent books, but the one we're focusing on today is this book right here called 2020's Foresights: 3 Vital Practices for Thriving in a Decade of Accelerating Change. And if we've learned anything in 2020, this is going to be a decade of accelerating change. So we do encourage you to get this book. And we'll highlight at the end, Tom has also very generously offered a book study for anyone who wants to join him in that. But we'll say more about that later. The person that will be interviewing and dialoguing with Tom today, as many of you know, is Todd Bolsinger. Todd is the executive director here of the Church Leadership Institute, and Todd has had many different positions at Fuller Seminary. He's been vital to the school overall. He joined in 2014 as vice president for vocation and formation, an assistant professor of practical theology, and again, now serves as our executive director. He's been a pastor for many, many years, and now he's a coaching consultant, and he runs the Church Leadership Institute. His most recent book is Tempered Resilience: How Leaders Are Formed in the Crucible of Change. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Todd, who will introduce Tom and all of our content. And like we said, if you do have questions, please chat them in. The questions will not be public. They will just come straight to me, and we will answer those as we get going. So again, welcome, and I will now hand this over to Todd.
Thanks, Josiah. Appreciate very much your willingness to do so. Welcome, all of you. I've noticed a number of friends' names on the list of attendees. Thank you for coming. It's always a great gift to see your names and to have you participate with us. Well, let me tell you a story about how we got here. Back in the 1980s, when I was just beginning to walk more deeply in my own personal faith, I had a personal conversion experience, and my faith was really built on this notion that I could have a relationship with Jesus. And then I discovered this book called The Mustard Seed Conspiracy. And this book told me that if I wanted to have a relationship with Jesus, I needed to understand how Jesus had this profound desire to be in relationship in a reconciling and redeeming way with the whole world. And the way that the smallest actions of faithfulness and justice and mercy could have impacts that were much larger than you can imagine. The Mustard Seed Conspiracy became one of the most important books in my life. I literally gave copies of it to almost everybody I knew. My wife has a copy that I signed to her when we were dating. I was such a romantic guy. I gave copies of Mustard Seed Conspiracy to a girl I was dating, hoping that she would be impressed by it. It really did shape me. And when I was at Hollywood Presbyterian Church, my friend Mark Roberts and I invited Tom Sine to come and do a workshop around Mustard Seed Conspiracy and his work there in Hollywood. And I met him for the very first time. Well, then imagine my delight when some 30 years later, I get an email from this man named Tom Sine, who's telling me about his book he's doing on future casting. And I thought to myself, futurist Tom Sine, this has got to be the Mustard Seed Conspiracy guy. So I immediately picked up the phone and called him, and we reconnected. And to meet literally one of my heroes was just an overwhelming privilege for me. Tom's book, 2020 Foresight, came out. I had the chance to read it and to say some very sincere words about how much I appreciated it. And I began to talk with Tom about the idea about, would he be willing to share some of his insights with the folks that we work with? And here's why. For those of you who know that adaptive change is the way in which we begin to lead differently in a deeply disrupted world. When the world has changed so dramatically that we get disoriented and we're not quite sure which direction to go, it's often hard to kind of pay attention to where God might be leading us into the future. And so some of the work that we do at the school is not only helping people understand what we call their core DNA, their essential values, the things that they need to preserve and hold on to when they're leading into the future, but to begin to pay attention to the places in the world where the pain of the world becomes the calling of God's people. Let me say just a bit more about this. I'm going to use the screen share just because I think this might be helpful for us. Dave Gibbons, who's a pastor in Southern California, gave a quote to me once that really shaped my thinking. He said, "The future is already here. It's just on the margins." What Dave was saying was, in the places where there is pain, the places in the world where that has not been given all the attention, the power, the privilege, the resources, the places where the folks who are in power and privilege and with resources have tended to neglect, those are the places where the future can be found, where when you lean into those pain points, you begin to discern how God might be taking us into the future. For those of us who do work on this, it means that we find ourselves having to grapple with the bias that we have in our churches, in our organizations, about our own self-survival. I experienced this disruption when I had a moment to go to be with a group of leaders in Silicon Valley. when I was talking about changes I was trying to implement as part of the senior team at Fuller Seminary. And I gave them a presentation that said, we need to change. If we don't change, the institution won't survive. And they looked at me and said, Todd, nobody cares whether your institution survives. They only care if your institution cares about them. So what you need to be doing is asking, what's going on out in the world that we should pay attention to, that we should care about? And that if we pay attention to those things, we might find the way that we can move forward into the future strategically, carefully. This became the center of the work that we often do on leading change. Because the default behavior for most organizational leaders, and this means church leaders, is to try to solve problems for our organizations. It's to make our church members more happy. It's to make our stakeholders more secure. It's to create the environment that is going to be that which makes all of us feel as if we've got more stability and trust, and we're doing fine, and we're surviving. But really what we need to be about, if we're going to be about God's agenda, is about the way that we need to change our organizations, that we need to go through transformation for meeting the needs of the world. For those of you who've ever worked with us know that we talk a lot about this adaptive change process that starts with our deepest values, a congregation's charism, the gift that they offer the world, and then responds to the pain of our neighbors. We believe the pain of our neighbors is the calling of God. We see this in the Gospels. We see blind Bartimaeus calling out to Jesus, have mercy on me. And Jesus saying, call him and bring him here. We see Jesus weeping over Jerusalem. And we understand that what Jesus is doing at that moment is bringing the gospel that's going to come into the world, not only for Jerusalem, but for the whole world. So the question we're often asking leaders to pay attention to, especially at the time of change, is while everything internally wants to focus on ourselves, what we need to be doing is focusing on what God is doing in the world and how God is usually doing that at the places of pain. So here are the two questions I want you to think about as I introduce Tom to tell you about his process of what he calls foresight and future sight. For Tom, it's not about trying to look at some crystal ball and predict the future. It's actually paying attention to the places where there's pain in the world and trusting that God is going to call us toward those places of pain, disruption, change, and that in those places of pain and disruption and change, we'll begin to develop the capacity to move forward into the future. So what I'd want you to think about, even as a church leader, is if Jesus was going into your community and he went into your community as your church, what would be calling your name? What would be breaking your heart? And can you believe that that which is calling your name and breaking your heart is an invitation from God, not only to faithfulness today, but into your future? How we do that, how we understand how that process works, how we get better and grow more proficient in that process is the work of Dr. Tom Sine, and work that he's been doing for decades and that I have benefited from for so long. And today it's my privilege to introduce him to you. So Tom, we're going to let you take it away. We'll let you teach us. We're going to be your students today, just like we'd been if we were in class, and then we'll have some conversations and as we go. So thank you very much, Tom.
Well, good morning to all my friends, Christian leaders in springtime in the United States, and our Australian friends, leaders in that beautiful country, are celebrating going into autumn. And so for all of you, what a gift. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful for Todd and Josiah and their facilitating this and making this possible. The pandemic has been really challenging for churches everywhere. And I'm glad to be busy again because I've had a longer vacation than I needed. So it's a wonderful time to be with you. I'm going to be as quick as I can to get us back. I want to hear your feedback, your pushback. And I'm going to start with my most recent book that I wrote with my friend Dwight Friesen, 220's Foresight, 3 Vital Practices for Thriving in a Decade of Accelerating Change. And we did something to make things very clear in this book. We talk about 3 dance steps for living in a time of dramatic change. And I'm just going to give you a quick sense of where this began for me. Some of you just in the United States, we've just celebrated the first Earth Day. And on that first Earth Day, I was a young 20-something working as a dean of students in Maui Community College in Hawaii. You know, lovely time. And we had a university professor come on that very first Earth Day just over 50 years ago. And he was a specialist in environmental research. And he came and addressed us with a stirring presentation for faculty and students that changed my life. Quite simply, he outlined some environmental challenges that we'd never dreamed of. And in those days, we lived in normal time. And what this discussion did in presentation, it moved me into changing time. No sooner had he completed his presentation, and I could tell everyone in the room was very, very attentive. About 50 of the students started down the street towards the ocean, and they had bags. I had no idea what that was about, but I tagged along. When they got to a motel, I discovered what it was about. There was huge amounts of the garbage of the week out on the beach for the ocean to take away. The students bagged 50 bags of that stuff, took it in, did a day-long sit-in. In those days, you did not stand up to authority, but they did. At 5 o'clock, the manager of the motel folded, signed up for a garbage service, and they took the stuff to the dump. 2 months after that, I actually quit my job and moved to Seattle to study for that doctorate in intellectual history. But I did a lot of research and study in the area of foresight and forecasting with business and environmental groups. And during that time, we even got the governor of the state where I live here in Washington State, and he put together a whole package as a year-long program that 6 states did of environmental changes that actually passed the legislature. Well, what I want to get to, though, I want to introduce you to the 3 simple dance steps that is in the book 220's Foresight, to give you an idea of a new way for Christian leaders to operate in a time of dramatic change. The first step is learning to anticipate. Seminaries do not teach, most seminaries do not teach those that will become pastors on how to anticipate the new waves of change, nor do they teach them how to broadly research innovative responses in our lives, in our communities, and working in people in the majority world. So I took that course, and since then I've been working with Christians who are working in majority countries like Haiti, where I worked for 7 years. And what I'm trying to help them to do, I'm trying to help people learn to listen carefully, not just to the things that are happening around them, but the people who are identifying new environmental changes, economic changes, and generational changes. I want to talk in a minute about the young people in your church. And so learning to anticipate the new waves of change. The next 3 to 5 years gives you room then to research much more innovative ways to respond. And I find many churches that I've worked with aren't even researching innovation in their own cities, let alone globally. But environmental planners, business planners, urban planners research aggressively to come up with an increased range of options. And people in the church need to do that, not just for the people we work with abroad and in our neighborhoods, but even in our own families. We need to be aware of new challenges and new opportunities. And the third step, step one is anticipating, step two is researching, and step three is selecting those new innovative ways of living and changing that most authentically reflect the way of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus. And I think in 220's Foresight, it's designed as a study book. And if you and your church decide to study that book, I would love to visit you and respond to your feedback, your pushback, your questions. But let me get to the people that churches seem to care about the most. In the last 30 plus years of working with churches, every church I've worked with in Britain, Australia, and the United States love their young people, adore their young people, but often are not fully aware of the challenges that Generation Next is facing. And I have some good news about change that most of you haven't heard of. Pew Research has been forecasting for over a decade that young people are going to stop affiliating with churches. Even those raised in churches are increasingly doing that. And pastors know that's true. They're experiencing it. And of course, during COVID, there was a lot of loss of members, including young people. What pastors don't know, and I don't understand why, because Pew Research has also been writing that Gen Y and Gen Z, essentially the under 54, are hardwired to care about the world they're in because they have focused in their reading and research online, and they're learning and anticipating. And as a consequence, these two groups of young people are much more concerned about the issues of the world and the society and the church, broadly speaking. And so they are interested in not only reading about economic justice, environmental justice, and racial justice, but it's at the center of the attention of many of the Gen Y and Gen Z folks, and they are motivated to use their lives in change making, neighborhood change making. One young woman that graduated from Christian college in the Midwest went to Europe. She went to some of the majority countries. When she came back, out of her concern for the refugees coming in, she started with church support a whole ministry in job training for some of the refugees that were not getting established. In a Black church, a young man started a ministry where in the neighborhood there were a lot of young people that are not having opportunities for employment. And he started a program in restaurant preparation for work there and for construction. And obviously, if young people could learn construction, they could have a decent wage for their family and for their life in the future. So the three dance steps are learning to anticipate, are learning to research innovative options, and to create new responses. So here's the challenge I have for you now. You already know that you're losing young people in your churches. I do Futures Creativity workshops, and I did my last one in a Presbyterian church not far from here. I love to do 1 or 2 day workshops with churches that have never thought about the future before. And one of the things that the church knew, they knew they were a growing congregation, but they didn't know that they they no longer had any young families. And so they came up with a very creative idea in the workshop of actually using an underutilized building to set up an arts program for elementary school students so that after they get out of school, they can spend those extra hours learning to do art and design and not charge their parents a penny to do this service and as a way to connect with young families. I also did my own research and discovered housing in this community, small town, West Coast, Washington State, um, that housing started at $600,000 a house. Well, you're not going to get young people to live there in that kind of a situation. So they actually started meeting, church leaders started meeting with meters in the city to change the codes on housing construction. And we discovered in the process, a farmer that was at this church said he was already building tiny houses for young couples who were looking for change. We need to learn in our local churches how to anticipate the new opportunities in our neighborhoods, but we also need to learn how to really move forward in researching innovative ways to respond. I want to come back to Gen Y and Gen Z. I call them the good news generation because the profiles on them that Pew Research and others write about, for some reason, pastors are not learning about. And that is that I wrote another book a few years ago called Live Like You Give a Damn, join the change making celebration. In fact, there's a podcast at Fuller you can get to hear about that. But the good news is these young people want to be change makers. So I'm encouraging you to do something radically different, to not only sit down with your 20 and 30-year-olds and talk to them about their concerns for the future, but help them actually launch new community efforts and empowerment in post-pandemic communities where there are people unemployed, building community gardens, job training. I urge you to listen to your young people's concern, and I'm going to suggest something even more radical, that you start inviting the input of young people in your neighborhood that are not members of your church, and even help them start new community ministries with young people in your church to really start making a difference in the people that are still struggling from the pandemic. I urge you to sit down with your young people and hear their stories, hear their concerns, and discover that a lot of them are not programmed to devote their lives to doing the American Dream house and doing, all that goes with it. But I also have a concern. The young people who have these concerns develop them through their iPhones. But with some of the new things going on with TikTok and some of the other tech firms, there's a lot of influence to undermine the kinds of things that we teach in all of our churches. So there's an educational opportunity to find new ways to do formation for young people who really care about communities and neighborhoods, but don't always understand the compelling ways of Jesus Christ that are designed to make lives change, but also communities as well. So I'm going to stop right there and say, I would love to hear your feedback, your questions, your pushback. I would love to be involved if you decide to do a book study. Anything I can do to engage and help you prepare others to be people who are not only followers of Jesus, but people who really want to make a difference in a world that needs new help and new dreams.
Tom, thank you so much. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that this is my Institute's podcast to ask you the most questions, because I've been very captivated by what you said. So let me invite the rest of you. A couple of you have begun to already give us some questions in the Q&A. We'll get to them, I promise you. We've got lots of good time here. If you haven't, if you would please make sure you put them there, because we're not watching the chat as much as we're watching the Q&A at this point. Okay, so Tom, let me ask you this question. You have these three dance steps: learn to anticipate, research, create new response. So let me ask you just a couple of questions. I'm going to walk you through all three of those before I turn over to the group. Learning to anticipate. What has been your experience about what makes it hard for people to anticipate what the future may be? Like what gets in our way? That seems like such an obvious thing to do, but we get stuck there. What's been your experience?
Well, I think for many decades, things weren't changing that rapidly. But with the coming of big tech, we're now seeing accelerating ranges of change. In fact, there's real concern now that big tech could create a difficulty and even having people post things that aren't true with people's faces that aren't there. And so it's raising some real new challenges that I don't want to get into now, but new opportunities as well. And so with young people who are techie wise, using that new tech as an educational tool for people that are unemployed, for example, and using that to explore new types of housing, because Gen Y and Gen Z, they not only aren't as drawn to the American dream house as their parents and grandparents, a lot of older folks don't realize they're not going to be able to afford it, because the cost of higher ed and the cost of housing is a whole different future than what we grew up in as older folks.
So let me ask you this question. If I'm on the older folks side of the equation now, because I was shaped in a world that didn't change as dramatically. So I didn't anticipate that the world was going to change so rapidly. Technology is one example. How do you start developing the capacity to anticipate? How do you begin to notice that?
Sure.
As a pastor, I'm not a researcher, right?
Sure. Well, that's why I went to the university here in Washington State, the University of Washington, and I went to schools of business and environmental planning. And there are ways to forecast 3 to 5 years in the future where you can be pretty accurate. We've never felt a need to do that before. And if we do that, that gives us lead time to research and adapt new practices in terms of the kind of constructive work that you do. That lead time can be precious for churches, for young people starting out their lives, and for some of us older folks, they're looking forward to reinventing our lives in these troubled times.
Thank you. So let's go to your next place. You say the word research all the time, and you say it like a researcher. Like, you realize that people like you who like doing research are excited. But let's talk to the people who they don't think of themselves as researchers. When you talk about research, you don't just mean like doing deep studies. You also talk about stuff like listening to people. So
there are business leaders and environmental leaders in a lot of our churches. We have in the Mennonite church that I go to, there's a gentleman that's worked in community research for redesigning cities. So there are people in our churches that are doing research all the time, but they're seldom asked by leadership to help do forecasts of what the new needs will be in our community in the next 5 years, or the new challenges facing people in the majority world that we've been working with. And one church found that because of the invention of some of the new research for collecting solar energy, they've started training young people in Africa to use and help others adopt solar outfits to provide new energy resources in communities that have never had electricity before. So it has tremendous benefit in anticipating not just new challenges, but new opportunities.
Actually, so it's an interesting thing. What you're saying, it seems so obvious, and yet you start realizing the gap that we often have in the church. You're basically saying there are people all around us whose jobs, whose livelihoods
That's
are
right.
trying to look at the world and anticipate how the world is changing. And if we listen to them humbly and well, they become collaborators. Actually, one of the first question in the chat was really like, who are the most obvious collaborators in this venture to learn from and with? And you're saying it's our church members and it's our
Yes.
neighbors, friends, right?
And your young people too,
Yeah,
because
actually, I'm gonna get to this piece about young people. Your passion for young people is amazing to me. So
they're
more
good
about,
news.
yeah. So say more about this listening to and like a kind of research of listening to these people who are in our world that we just don't seem to listen to, right? Is that the
Right. Well, because we're going to be having Australians join us in this as well. My wife is an Australian. She did the whole uh, medical program there, became a doctor, worked with the First Mercy Ship for 10 years before we were married. And for the last 30 years here in Seattle, we do a co-living. We have an ancient house, 1910, with three two-bedroom units. And we rent it exclusively to young people that are starting out at a significantly reduced rent if they will have a meal with us once a week with faith reflection and garden with us and once a month. And they're teaching us now how to make sense of the world as their generation sees it. So we're getting the benefit for reduced rent of regular learning, but also appreciating the issues because frankly, a lot of the young folks young couples are seriously considering whether or not to have children because of they are so convinced that the environmental challenges are so daunting. They are that their concern is much more pronounced than their parents or grandparents that are still in denial about climate change.
Tom, you are modeling for us the kind of research that I'm looking for, which is it's not just book knowledge. It's mostly talking to neighbors, friends. It's
Yes.
talking to people who are in your life. It's invite young people into your life so you can listen to them. They're actually also shaping us. How might we create churches that have more of this capacity and enthusiasm for listening to our neighbors, to listening to folks we don't usually listen to?
Well,
what are some other practical ways we could do that?
I would encourage as one of the first things to deal with the changing times as churches everywhere are recovering from the pandemic is sitting down with their young people and inviting their input on both the concerns that they see in the neighborhood, in the community, and even invite young people in the neighborhood that are not churchgoers. This is radical. That are not churchgoers, but would very much like to start a job training program or something else. I'd like to see churches get as daring as working with young people in both their church and their neighborhoods to do neighborhood empowerment projects, job training, like the training that I mentioned of the Black church in areas with high unemployment, where they were training in housing construction and restaurant work. It provided employment for a lot of young people in a Black community that would not have had many options otherwise. So I think starting with your young people and setting up some extended time to listen to them, but also invite their ideas for empowerment in the wake of what we've just been through.
It's interesting. One of the people who wrote into the Q&A asked about some approaches for convening conversations with local young people who don't participate in the church life. What you're basically saying in one sense is that you combine your research and your new response steps, right? Like go talk to people. You put this language that I think is going to end up in some of my presentations. Hear them and help them, right?
Right.
Hear them, hear their concerns, help them with the things they are concerned about, not just our agenda, right?
Yep.
It's paying attention to their
Their
agenda.
ideas, take their ideas seriously where there are, where there are possibilities. Sure.
Yeah. When you think about this notion of us engaging with any of our neighbors, and you passionately talk about young people, what do you think makes it hard for those of us in the church to put ourselves in the position of hearing and helping them? It seems like we're pretty good at polling and asking them to help us, right? Like we.
Well, I think what's undermining a lot of us is the same tech that awakened young people to the needs has us seduced to be a part of Instagram envy, where we're constantly expanding our ability to consume and purchase and display. And that takes away from not only money, but time that could be invested elsewhere. And one of the books that I love, that I recommend, is Making Room by Christine Pohl, because she points out in the first century, church was not a building you went to once a week. It was a community where upper class people and people with lower incomes lived together, and they worked like one large family. And church wasn't a couple hours on Sunday. Doing the work of Jesus was 7 days a week. So they found ways to really empower one another, and their Christian faith, which in this country right now is becoming more and more minimalized, really became central for the first 100 years before we discovered how to build church buildings.
Well, okay, so you just said something that is going to just cheer everybody from Fuller Seminary. Christine Pohl's book is one of our absolute favorites. It may be one of the books that is most required in more classes. And it's because at the heart of it, so I think you just made a connection for me. What you're basically saying is, if we're connected to, let's just use the example of young people. You have a passion for young people. That's amazing. If we are listening to young people who are becoming more aware of the pain in the world because of their technology, what we said is, instead of keep offering them technology, let's offer them hospitality. Let's offer into relationship as a way of doing research, not just because a relationship is a way of creating new responses, right?
Yeah, and if we can help reduce their school debt or have them live with us so they've got their hours free, not to be paying off loans, but use those hours to be making a difference in their neighborhoods, they'd be a lot happier. And I think you would be gratified to see people that have resources to set them free from that debt and have homes where they've got extra bedrooms for them to live so they could have more time free to be involved in change making instead of money making.
So it's interesting. Part of what strikes me, again, you're modeling for us, Tom, is when I think futurist, I think of someone who is just trying to lay out this map. You're actually modeling for us a kind of discerning the future by going deeply into relationship with the people around us, so that we can learn and then we can participate in the building of the future.
The constructive change that you're advocating, exactly.
Change. What a great phrase. Okay, so I want to read you a longer quote that somebody put into the Q&A that I think is really beautiful, and I want you to respond to it. Okay, he said, a person wrote in, I believe it was Dorothy Day who asked why it is when she feeds the poor, she is called a saint, but when she asks why the poor are hungry, she is called a communist. Tom, do you have guidance for the church's engagement with the systems and structures that create much of the suffering?
Well, we've got to do something, because so many of the churches in the majority world are still dependent upon income and resources from Western countries. And with the churches in Australia, in Great Britain, in New Zealand, in the United States, in Canada, we're seeing declining numbers, not just in mainline, but evangelical churches. and our capacity to respond in our own communities and globally is going down. So we just have to wake up to creating churches that are there for others and not just as a place we show up, two or three times a month. We need churches, and that's why living together, so we can free up time and free up young people or others to be change makers, is one way to share our faith in Jesus Christ.
One of the reasons why your work resonates with those of us at the Church Leadership Institute is that if you saw that diagram that I started with, we start with our values, what we call our charism. The charism is it's that great Catholic word that talks about the way in which our values become the gift, the specific gift we offer as a community to the world, like the differences between Benedictine and Jesuits. They're both Catholics, but they offer a different gift to the world. It goes toward the pain point, these places where we almost hear the invitation of the calling of God for our gift that breaks our hearts in a particular way, the way you've kind of beautifully modeled the way your heart is for young people. But then it requires a kind of transformation. And what's interesting is that almost every time I ask you a question about research, you give me an answer about embodiment, right? You say, for us to really know this stuff, we're going to have to live with these people. For us to really learn these things, we're going to have to listen to these people. For us to really get engaged in these issues and the issues that are around us, we're going to actually have to go and serve and help people who are in the middle of those issues. What you're modeling for us is a kind of learning and seeing the future by living into it step by step. Am I reading that right? Am I reading that?
Yeah, you're right on target. And let me just mention, because I did a podcast with Fuller on an earlier book about 7 years ago, and it's about young people. It has a very rude title, so please forgive me. I'm going to hold it up. Live Like a Give a Damn. Join the change-making generation. And it's about young people who are really trying to find ways to make a difference. And of a church that actually ran an annual contest for 10 years for young people in their community in the Twin Cities area. If you won the money, you got not only money from the church, the business people in the church, your launch community. And the first woman that won, she was concerned because she found the poor and the elderly had no grocery stores anywhere nearby. Mobile market. She bought 4 school buses. The business people in the church helped her launch, and none of those young people involved were expected to attend that church. They just did it because they cared about the community. For 10 years, 10 projects, and they blessed the community by empowering young people that gave a damn.
Hey, Tom, so these stories, actually somebody wrote into the Q&A, hey, how do we hear more stories like this? How do we collect them or find them? So, because even the way you've told these stories, I find I'm wanting more examples. Do you, besides your books, do you have any other place where these stories are collected?
Yeah, I'm still up and moving, and I do 1 to 2 day creativity workshops. And when I do them, I do a lot of research ahead of time, like the folks that I worked with in this small town here in Washington State Presbyterian Church. And so I enjoy getting to know people and helping them research their own future in their church and in their neighborhood and in their community, and actually create new possibilities that they implement. So that's, and hey, I'm available, as you know, in terms of either of these books, to do Zoom visits with groups that are doing study with no charge at all, 2 hours with anybody that's studying either the 2 books, my recent 2 books. I'm available if we can just set up the calendar. It's nothing more important to be doing.
Oh my gosh, your generosity. We're going to tell you in a few moments, friends, how you can actually sign up to be able to have Tom Sine attend your book discussion about his book about the future. So that's an opportunity here for you. we're going to let Josiah tell us some of these things before we end so that people can know the next steps. Tom, is there any final story or final charge you want to give us? Learn to anticipate, research, which we know now research means is more about relationships than it means just about sitting in a library.
And innovation.
Create new responses, innovate. Anything else you want to charge? You'll have 200 leaders who signed up for this podcast. So
yeah, I'd love to talk to anybody if there's time for questions. We're getting close.
Yeah. Well, then let's do this. Let's make sure that we get a chance for people to get your material. You've had a chance to answer a number of these questions today. Let me have Josiah come back on and give us a response to it. Tom, I want to say that even just being in this conversation with you again reminds me of what you did in my own heart as a young leader, reminding me that the church is not just about the institution, it's about the impact it makes for the sake of the cause of Christ, for the sake of the glory of God, for the sake of raising up disciples who will change the world. You really have, your life has been a mustard seed that has grown in a beautiful way.
Well, God bless you, Todd. I so appreciate all you're doing at Fuller, and I am deeply grateful for this chance to meet with you and have a chance to talk to friends in both Australia and the United States. I would love to learn more what they're doing. Have them contact me just to tell me I'd love to hear what they're doing and their questions. twsign@gmail.com, twsign@gmail.com. I'd love to hear what they're struggling with and their creative ideas.
Thank you. That's great. Josiah, why don't you come on and close us out and give some folks some opportunities to follow up with all of these things.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much, Tom and Todd. That was such a good discussion. So again, I just want to highlight Tom has made his email available, but we can connect you also directly to Tom. So if you're interested in having him host a 2-hour discussion with you about his book, please do email us, cli@fuller.edu, and we can go in and connect you with Tom. That's cli@fuller.edu. I also want to highlight that besides the content we put out, our main offering at the Church Leadership Institute are our adaptive church leadership cohorts. And our current ones right now are fully online, 18 months long, where we go through all of this in pretty serious depth. We're going to be starting one this fall that's going to be a shorter 6-month version of that. You can learn more about that if you go to our website, dupree.org/church. But again, feel free to email us directly at cli@fuller.edu. And we can tell you more about that. We can give you pricing options. We have a very generous grant from the Lilly Foundation. We're able to subsidize and scholarship churches through this, but this is really where we get to dive in and do this work pretty intentionally, pretty in depth for an extended period of time. So again, please do email us, cli@fuller.edu. I want to thank you all for being here. Many of you had asked in the chat and Q&A if you can get these slides. And yes, look for an email from me either tonight or tomorrow, and we will give you these slides and link to all these books and various resources. And as always, if you need anything else at all, we're here for you at CLI. We appreciate you, and we're so thankful for you to join us today. Please do enjoy the rest of your day wherever you're at. And Tom, thank you very much.
Thank you.